Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the different types of sentences that we have in English. But before we do that, we're going to need to briefly review clauses and phrases. So I'm going to move real fast through that. Now, first off, the difference between a clause and a phrase is a clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. A phrase does not have a subject and a verb in it. And the most important piece of this is the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. Both of those types of clauses have a subject and a verb because they're clauses, but an independent clause can stand on its own. It makes sense by itself. It can be a sentence on its own. It doesn't need anything else. It can stand independently, so it's an independent clause. A dependent clause, on the other hand, does not make sense on its own. It depends on other information in order to be a sentence. So, some examples here. First off, we have the man went to the store to buy bread and milk. That's an independent clause because it makes sense by itself. On the right-hand side, though, we have although he went to the store. That's a dependent clause because it cannot stand by itself. Now, the difference between those two is going to be really, really important today as we talk about different types of sentences. So I want you to remember that an independent clause can stand on its own. A dependent clause cannot. With that said, we are going to talk a little bit more about sentence types. And the reason why we're talking about different types of sentences today is because we punctuate sentences differently depending on what type of sentence they are. So the types of sentences that we talk about today are going to matter a lot once we talk a little bit more about punctuation. It's like a building block towards talking about commas, semicolons, etc. Now, there are four main types of sentences in English. The first is simple, the second is compound, the next is complex, and then we have compound complex. We're going to talk about all four of these today, so make sure that you watch for those four types: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. We're going to start with simple, though. A simple sentence is simply a sentence that is one independent clause. So we talked about independent clauses a moment ago. They're a clause that can stand on its own. A simple sentence is just one independent clause. There's nothing else going on. One subject, one verb, one idea. Our examples here: he walked to the car, she completed the test. They're short, they're straight to the point. There's only one clause inside of those. Next, though, we have compound sentences. And compound sentences are when we take more than one independent clause and we combine those together. So our example says the school board voted to change the school's boundaries, but the community overturned the decision with an appeal. Now you'll notice that this has two independent clauses in it. The first is the school board voted to change the school's boundaries. That could be a sentence by itself. It's an independent clause. But then we've combined it with another independent clause. The community overturned the decision with an appeal. So again, a compound sentence is a sentence with more than one independent clause inside of it. Now, there are some rules for how we put those independent clauses together, and there's two main options for you. The first option is that we can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction to join independent clauses together. We're going to talk more about coordinating conjunctions in just a minute, but that's option one, comma plus coordinating conjunction. Option number two is that we can put a semicolon between them. So if you have never known how to use a semicolon before, here you go. Here's your answer. You put one independent clause, semicolon, another independent clause, and that's how semicolons work. So again, when we're working with compound sentences, we only have these two options for joining them together. Now let's look at a little bit more information here. Our top example is an example of two independent clauses that have been joined together with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. You can see it's the example we looked at before. We have the school board voted to change the school's boundaries, comma, but the community overturned the decision with an appeal. But is a coordinating conjunction. We'll talk more about coordinating conjunctions in just a moment. The bottom example is the exact same sentence. It's the exact same compound sentence, but we've used a semicolon to join our independent clauses rather than a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Now, we've talked a lot about coordinating conjunctions, and here they are. Our coordinating conjunctions in English are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And you may be familiar with these coordinating conjunctions based on the acronym FANBOYS. FANBOYS is a way to remember all of them, but these are all of the coordinating conjunctions. And again, their only job is to combine independent clauses. So I can put a comma and any of these between two independent clauses, and it works. I was hungry, comma, so I ate breakfast. I was hungry, comma, but I did not eat breakfast. I was hungry, or excuse me, I was hungry, and I ate breakfast. All of those are examples of how we might use commas and fanboys to join independent clauses together. And I want to remind you that a sentence that has more than one independent clause is called a compound sentence. Now, next up, we have complex sentences. Complex sentences are sentences that have a dependent clause and an independent clause. Here's our example. After we watched the basketball game, dependent clause, we went out to ice cream, independent clause. So as you can see in this example, we've combined a dependent clause with an independent clause. Therefore, we have a complex sentence. Now, here's the way this works. If we have a dependent clause at the beginning, so if our dependent clause comes before the independent clause, then what we're going to do is we are going to put a comma at the end of the dependent clause. So you can see our dependent clause ends at game. After we watch the basketball game, we're going to put a comma right there, and then we're going to put our independent clause. We went out to ice cream. Now, on the other hand, if we switch the order of these and we put the independent clause first and the dependent clause last, we are not going to put a comma between them. So all I've done in this example is I've switched the order. We went out to ice cream. That's our independent clause. That makes sense by itself. After we watch the basketball game. That's the dependent clause. It doesn't make sense by itself. So if the dependent clause comes at the end, we no longer need a comma between them. So to review, comma goes after the dependent clause if the dependent clause is at the beginning. If the dependent clause is at the end, no commas. Now, something else that's very, very, very important about complex sentences. Something called a subordinating conjunction. And what a subordinating conjunction is it's a word that turns a dependent clause into, it's a word that turns an independent clause into a dependent, turns an independent into a dependent. All of these are examples of subordinating conjunctions. I would recommend that you take a screenshot of this, that you write these down, that you make note of these somehow, because these subordinating conjunctions are the magic words that show us if we have a dependent clause. If you have a clause with one of these words at the beginning of it, it is a dependent clause. So let's go back to ours before. After we watch the basketball game. After we watch the basketball game is a dependent clause. But it's a dependent clause because of the word after. If we didn't have the word after at the beginning, we would have an independent clause. We watched the basketball game is an independent clause. But as soon as we put the word after at the beginning, that subordinating conjunction at the beginning, it now turns into a dependent clause. That's why these subordinating conjunctions are so important, because if you see one of these at the beginning of a clause, that means that you have a dependent clause. And then you're going to need to follow the punctuation rules that apply to complex sentences. Now moving forward, we also have compound complex sentences. And compound complex sentences are simply a combination of a compound sentence and a complex sentence. So you'll remember that a compound sentence is a sentence with more than one independent clause. A complex sentence is a sentence with a dependent clause and an independent clause. So a compound complex sentence is a sentence that has two independent clauses and one dependent clause. Here's an example. Although I was hungry, dependent clause, I decided to skip breakfast, independent clause, and I regretted it all day, independent clause. Now, the same rules that we've talked about before still apply here. So although I was hungry is a dependent clause, and because it comes at the beginning, we're going to put a comma after it. Then we have I decided to skip breakfast, which is an independent clause. And then because we have another independent clause after that, I regretted it all day, we're going to combine those with a comma and a fanboy. Now again, today what we've talked about is 4 different types of sentences: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Those sentence types are important because they determine where we put punctuation. We put commas after dependent clauses in complex sentences if the dependent clause is at the beginning. If the dependent clause is at the end, then we do not put commas between them. If we are combining 2 independent clauses into a compound sentence, then we put a comma and a coordinating conjunction between the independent clauses. You can remember the coordinating conjunctions as fanboys. Thank you so much for watching today. I really appreciate it.